And then how this effort continued in the life of Abu Bakr, where the first full compilation of the Quran was gathered, verified by the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And then how, with the passage of time, in the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, the script of the Quran was standardized. Through the efforts of Uthman radiallahu anhu, how this Quran was then distributed, disseminated, and how the scholars of the Quran, they taught the Quran, and alhamdulillah, we have the Quran in front of us today. One thing which we mentioned, which we would like to, inshallah, mention in greater detail today, is the sab'atu ahruf. We mentioned that the unique quality of the Mus'haf of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, the one that was gathered in its time, was that the script of the Quran, it contained within it the sab'atu ahruf. Similarly, in the Quran, in the Mus'haf of Uthman radiallahu anhu, the script of the Quran facilitated for the sab'atu ahruf. Now what exactly is the sab'atu ahruf? In a hadith narrated by Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala in his Sahih, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam mentions, إِنَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ أُنزِلَ عَلَى سَبْعَةِ أَحْرُفٍ فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْ. Verily this Quran has been revealed upon sab'atu ahruf. Inshallah we'll detail what this means. This Quran has been revealed on sab'atu ahruf, so recite therefrom whichever is easy for you. So what is the sab'atu ahruf? This is one of the more difficult discussions in the ulum of the Quran. But it is important for us as believers to understand what sab'atu ahruf is, and also to appreciate the different qira'at that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed the Quran to be recited in. So right from the offset, it is important to clear up a misconception. The sab'atu ahruf is different, is not the same thing as the 7 qira'at. We might have heard of the 7 different qira'as. 7 different qira'as. The qira'ah which we read, which is very popular, is the qira'ah of Imam Hafs rahmatullahi alayhi, who narrates from his teacher. We'll discuss this inshallah in detail as we go on. The qira'ah which we find prevalent in our back home countries, the qira'ah of Imam Hafs. The qira'ah which we find prevalent in Morocco and the Maghrib, the qira'ah of Imam Warsh. The qira'ah, the 7 famous qira'ahs, are different from the sab'atu ahruf. When we say the sab'atu ahruf, the Quran is not referring to the 7 famous qira'ahs. How can this be? This is something what we call anachronistic. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is mentioning the hadith, the qira'ahs of the imams and being attributed to the 7 imams, they came after. So the important thing to understand is that the sab'atu ahruf and the 7 famous qira'ahs which we find, they're not synonymous, they're not the same thing. The reason why the 7 qira'ahs became famous and popular was a certain scholar of qira'ah, his name was Imam Ibn al-Mujahid, to facilitate and to make easy the recitation of the Quran according to different qira'ahs. He gathered these 7 qira'ahs in one book. And from there, a person that studies the different qira'at, they study the 7 qira'at together. So alhamdulillah, we were blessed with the opportunity to study these 7 qira'at with our teacher. So we studied these 7 together. You recite the Quran, every verse you repeat, however many differences there are in the qira'ah, you recite them at the same time. But the qira'at are not 7 only. There are 10 qira'at which are mutawatira, 10 qira'at which are mass transmitted, which form the Quran. Inshallah, we'll touch upon these 10 qira'at, but there's 7 in one place and there's 3 other. These are known as thalatha mutammima. So the practice of the scholars of qira'at is to recite the 7 together and then 3 additional qira'at. But when we talk about the sab'atu ahruf, which Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was referring to, this means something different. And there are many different opinions regarding what sab'atu ahruf is. What we know is that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when the Quran was revealed, he permitted the Sahaba radiallahu anhum to recite from any of these 7 ahruf. He allowed them to recite from the sab'atu ahruf for the sake of ease. And this was common, prevalent amongst the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentions that I asked Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam, he came and he revealed the Quran to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam taught the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam one harf from the 7. Then the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam asked him for another harf. Again Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam gave him another harf. And this continued until 7 different modes of recitation of the Quran were given to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So based on this, some scholars have put forward the opinion that what is meant by the sab'atu ahruf is, in the Arabic language, many a time the number 7 is used not to denote 7 individual things, but it is used as a number to show kathra, to show many. So the word 7 doesn't mean 7, it means many. So when the Prophet ﷺ said, the Quran has been revealed on sab'atu ahruf, these scholars say it means many different ways of recitation to facilitate ease, and the different Arabian tribes that were living at the time, to make it easy for them, Allah Ta'ala allowed the Quran to be recited in multiple different ways. However, when we look at the corpus of hadith, this opinion cannot be correct. And one of the reasons this opinion cannot be correct is this hadith in particular, where Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam says, أقرأني جبريل على حرف فراجعته فلم أزل أستزيده ويزيدني حتى انتهى إلى 7 أحرف. That one by one I asked Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam to allow me to recite the Quran in one more way, and then another way, and then another way, until we reach 7. So this shows that the number 7 which Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is mentioning is the actual number 7, and it cannot be translated as many. Rather, the literal number 7 is what is meant. And then some other scholars mention that what is meant by sab'atu ahruf is that there were 7 tribes of Arabia, and Allah allowed the Quran to be recited according to the dialect of those 7 tribes of Arabia at that time. So there were certain tribes that they would use one word, and another tribe would use a slightly different word to denote the exact same meaning. So the second opinion is that the sab'atu ahruf is 7 different dialects of the tribes of Arabia, and Allah allowed the Quran to be recited in those 7 different dialects to facilitate for the recitation and to make it easy for the different tribes of Arabia. But again, this does not seem to be the accurate opinion, because the 7 different tribes, there were not only 7 tribes in Arabia, there were many tribes in Arabia. So what's special about these 7 tribes that Allah allowed them to recite in their own dialect and the other tribes were not allowed? And when we look at the hadith again, this cannot be the correct opinion, because the sab'atu ahruf, we find Sahaba radiallahu anhum who were from the Quraysh. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam taught one Sahabi one harf, and he taught another Sahabi another harf. So one Sahabi would recite it in one way, and the other Sahabi would recite it in another way. But both of them were from the tribe of the Quraysh. So we can safely say that the sab'atu ahruf is not 7 specific dialects of the Arabs. And there are many other opinions which the ulama have expressed. But the most muhaqqaq, the opinion which has the most evidence and the strongest opinion, and this is the tahqiq of Mufti Taqi Uthmani hafidhahullah ta'ala, one of the greatest scholars of our time. And there are many other scholars in the past who have held this opinion. Experts in the field of qira'ah, they agree that this is the most sound opinion. And that is that Allah Ta'ala allowed for 7 different types of variations in recitation to facilitate ease. 7 different types of variations. Rather than 7 dialects, Allah Ta'ala allowed 7 different variations by which we can recite the Quran with ease, or the tribes of Arabia at that time, all of them, they can recite with ease. So for example, there may be, for example, in the Quran, when we study the 7 qira'at, or when we study the different qira'at, we see that sometimes in one place we have وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ. وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ. And in another harf, another variant of this recitation is وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَاتُ رَبِّكَ. And the difference in Arabic is kalimatu is singular, kalimat is plural. In meaning, in this particular context, both mean exactly the same thing. وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَاتُ رَبِّكَ. But this is one form of variation which Allah Ta'ala allowed, where sometimes there's a singular form, sometimes there's a plural form. Sometimes the difference is, again this is more to do with Arabic, where something is used in a masculine form and sometimes it's used in a feminine form. In the Arabic language, every word, every noun and every verb is either masculine or feminine. And there's a slight variation in each verb or in each noun to denote its masculinity or its femininity. So for example, in the Quran, some places in one qira'ah is la yuqbalu. In another qira'ah is la tuqbalu. Exactly the same word, yuqbalu, tuqbalu. The difference is one is masculine, yuqbalu, and the other is feminine. So another variation which Allah Ta'ala allowed to facilitate ease for this recitation was the variation between masculine and feminine. Some tribes would use certain words masculine, some tribes would use them feminine. Allah Ta'ala allowed this variation for the purpose of ease. The third is a difference in the haraka, in the i'rab. Now we know that not a single haraka of the Quran has been changed. When we say not a single haraka of the Quran has been changed, what we mean by this is Allah allowed the Quran to be recited with sometimes variations in the i'rab, in variations in the haraka. And the meaning takes absolutely no impact. It's just that certain tribes, they would use certain harakat on these words and other tribes would recite them slightly differently. An example of this is in one place Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions هَلْ مِنْ خَالِقٍ غَيْرُ اللَّهِ. هَلْ مِنْ خَالِقٍ غَيْرُ اللَّهِ. And the grammatical composition غَيْرُ اللَّهِ is something is with a rafa, is with a dhamma, with a pesh. And in another qira'ah, another harf is هَلْ مِنْ خَالِقٍ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ. The meaning is exactly the same. The grammatical composition of the sentence is exactly the same. It's just some tribes, they would analyze and they would say ghayrullah, some would say ghayrillah. Allah allowed for this variation too. So again, the first was the difference, the variation between a singular and a plural. Sometimes the variation was between a masculine and a feminine. The third was the i'rab, the harakat, slight variations. Allah Ta'ala allowed for this. The fourth is the form of the verb. Again, this is to do with the Arabic language. The form of the verb. In Arabic, verbs, they have a very specific meter and form which they follow. And there's an entire science dedicated to the studying of verbs in Arabic. It's known as ilm al-sarf, where we take one verb and we learn about all the different variations. So for example, in the Arabic language, if you take alima, one verb which means to know. From that one verb, you can extract thousands of verbs. Alima, alima, alimu, alimat, ya'lamu, ya'lamani, yu'lamu, yu'lamani, la ya'lamu, la yu'lamu. All of these verbs, variations, they come from this. So these verb variations, for example, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions ya'rishun. Another variation of this verb, yu'arrishun. Both mean exactly the same thing. وَمِمَّا يَعْرِشُونَ. Allah ta'ala is referring to the honeybee. And the honeybee, it sometimes makes its nest in thatched roofs, in the roofs which people make out of hay on their houses. Ya'rishun, yu'arrishun. Both mean exactly the same thing. Slight variation in the verb form. So this is the fourth type of variation which Allah Ta'ala allowed. The fifth type is a slight variation in the particles that are being used. These are known as huruf in Arabic grammar. So for example, in one place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions لَكِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ. Another qira'ah is لَكِنِ الشَّيَاطِينَ. لَكِنَّ, لَكِنْ. The difference is one is with a shadda, لَكِنَّ, and the other is لَكِنْ, without a shadda. Again, the translation, the meaning is exactly the same. The sixth is that the harf, the harfs, they change around. For example, in one place Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions nunshizuha. Nunshizuha. And another variant is nanshuruha. They're spelt exactly the same. They mean exactly the same thing. The difference is nunshizuha is with a zai and nanshuruha is with a ra. Both mean exactly the same thing. So sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed for a slight variation in the word that's being used. So one tribe would use nanshuruha, means to spread something out. Nunshizuha means to spread something out. One tribe would use nanshuruha, one tribe would use nunshizuha. Allah allowed for this variation. The seventh is differences in accent. Differences in accent. So certain tribes, for example, now for us it becomes very, when we hear a different qira'ah, it's strange to us because it's something we haven't heard. We are familiar with one qira'ah and that's it. We're not aware of these variations. So for example, we read Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim with a sad. Now this sad, in certain tribes, they would pronounce it za. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, sirat al-ladhina an'amta. That's how they pronounce it. And this is one of the mutawatir qira'ah. This is how one of the ways Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam taught it. Similarly, some tribes, we read wadduha. Some tribes would read wadduha with a slight variation. What they do is, it's called imala sughra, where they stretch their mouth slightly. And some tribes would recite wadduha. Again, these are all mutawatir qira'ah. They are all the Quran. It's part of our belief to accept that these are all the Quran. So sometimes so the accent variations which existed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed for them. Similarly, we in Surah Al-Fatiha, we have an'amta alayhim. Some tribes, they would say an'amta alayhum. And Allah ta'ala allowed for this. So in a mutawatir qira'ah, it's sirat an'amta. Is it an'amta alayhim? غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Okay, so both of them they read hum rather than him. So these are the 7 different types of variation. Some other scholars have given slight different, but this is what they say, this is the most correct opinion. In this, now when we say the 7 different types of variations, then this encompasses all the mutawatir qira'at, the 7 famous qira'as and the 3 which are added to the 7. These all are encompassed by these 7 variations. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he said the Quran has been revealed on the sab'atu ahruf, the sab'atu ahruf, if we interpret it to mean 7 different types of variations, then every qira'ah, so right, like we said, there's 7 qira'ah, they were compiled in one book, there's 3 more qira'ah, the ashara, the 10 qira'at are known as the mutawatir qira'at, they are mass transmitted. All of them are encompassed within these sab'atu ahruf. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed for the Quran to be recited in multiple different ways. And Allah mentions, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. Verily, we had made the Quran easy for recitals, so is there anyone to take heed? So respected brothers and elders, we see that the Quran has been through many, many stages. In the sense that from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam till our present day, a great effort has been exerted to preserve this Quran. And we mentioned this in our last lesson and in the previous lesson, that a great scholar by the name of Shah Waliullah Dihlawi rahimahullah, he mentions that the greatest favor that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has done upon us is the fact that he received the Quran and he conveyed the Quran to us. And when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam received the Quran, it was not an easy task. We spoke about the difficulties of receiving wahi, how heavy and burdensome it was upon the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And then we spoke about the efforts of the Sahaba. Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu, when he was tasked with compiling the Quran, he said, to move mountains from their places is easier for me than to do this great task of preserving the Quran. And the meticulous detail with which the Sahaba radiallahu anhum worked together to compile the Quran. and how they not only preserved the words of the Quran, but they preserved the meanings of the Quran too. Inshallah, what we'd like to touch upon now is some of the conditions for benefiting from the Quran. So the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed to us as a book of guidance. In the beginning verses of the first surah that we recite, Surah Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions Hudan lin-nas, that this book is a book of guidance. But there are certain conditions which we must fulfill, or certain attitudes which we must adopt towards the Quran for us to be able to benefit from the Quran. Because in another place in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions يهدي به كثيرا ويضل به كثيرا يضل به كثيرا ويهدي به كثيرا. That through this book Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala misguides many, and through it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides many. So there are certain conditions which we must fulfill for us to be able to take benefit from the Quran. And this I'm sharing with you from a book written by one of the great scholars, and alhamdulillah he is also our grandfather teacher. His name is Shaykh Abul Hasan Ali An-Nadawi rahimahullah ta'ala. Shaykh Abul Hasan Ali An-Nadawi rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the great scholars. He passed away on the 31st of December 1999. And subhanallah, an amazing scholar. He was a person that was accepted all over the world. When he passed away, his Salatul Ghaib was read in Al-Masjid Al-Haram in Mecca and in Medina. And thousands, hundreds of thousands attended his janazah in where he passed away in India. And not only was he accepted in the Islamic world, in Oxford University, he was head of the Islamic faculty of Oxford University. There's a plaque in Oxford University in commemoration memory of this great scholar. This great scholar, he had a special link with the Quran, and he spent his entire life in studying the Quran, teaching the Quran, and contemplating, doing tadabbur over the Quran. So from the Quran, he has gathered a few things which will result in us being able to benefit from the Quran. He mentions in خطاب القرآن العظيم عام لجميع الجنس البشري, that the Quran is directed towards the entirety of mankind, not just towards believers. The Quran, the khitab, the announcements and the speech of the Quran is directed towards the entirety of mankind. ولكن كما أن قطع الأرض تختلف فيما بينها في مراتب استعدادها وصلاحيتها ودرجة حاجتها إلى الماء وشدة انتظارها له. He says, but just like different pieces of land, they are different in how much water they accept. Certain pieces of land, they accept the water, they absorb the water, and they grow crops therefrom. Certain types of land, they take the water, they store it, but no crops grow therefrom. And there are certain types of land, the rain falls upon it and it washes away. Now this here, he's making a reference to the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned, my example and the example of the hidayah which I have been sent with, meaning the Quran and all of its lessons, is like three different types of people. And he mentioned these three. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam explains, that is the example of one who accepts, who absorbs the hidayah, the Quran and its guidance, and then he teaches it to people. The first type of land that absorbed the water and grew crops is like the person that absorbs the guidance of the Quran and then shares it with others. The second type of person who absorbs and stores the water is like a person who receives the revelation, he learns it, he doesn't internalize it, but others are able to benefit from it. Now this person, there is some hope for him because others are benefiting from him. But in reality, this person has lost out too, because he has taken and stored the knowledge and the guidance that is contained within the Quran, but he hasn't benefited from it himself. He hasn't absorbed it. And the third type of person is that person who the guidance comes to him and it washes over him. He doesn't absorb anything, nor does he benefit others thereby. So similarly, the Quran is the same. The Quran is the guidance from Allah Ta'ala. So the Quran, with regards to the Quran, there will be these three categories too. There are certain attitudes which we can have, which will allow us to benefit from the Quran. He mentions a verse of the Quran. Allah Ta'ala mentions, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَلَا يَزِيدُ الظَّالِمِينَ إِلَّا خَسَارًا. That from the Quran, within the Quran, we will reveal that which is a cure and a mercy for the believers. And it will not increase the disbelievers, the wrongdoers, except in loss. So we see that this Quran is a means of guidance, is a cure, is a means of mercy, but for the mu'mineen. As for those who have the wrong attitude towards it, this will only increase them in their loss. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, قُلْ هُوَ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا هُدًى وَشِفَاء وَالَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ فِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرٌ وَهُوَ عَلَيْهِمْ عَمَى أُولَٰئِكَ يُنَادَوْنَ مِن مَّكَانٍ بَعِيدٍ. Say, O Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this Quran is a source of guidance and a cure for those who believe in it. As for those who do not believe in it, it is as if their ears are blocked. فِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرٌ. There is something blocking their ears, and they are completely blind with regards to the Quran. It is as if they are being called from a distant place. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses a beautiful metaphor here to describe these people. We may have experienced when someone is calling us from far away, we're seeing something moving, we hear some sound in the distance, but we cannot make out what this person is saying. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, for some people the Quran, despite it being clear, despite it being recited to them and explained to them, it is as if يُنَادَوْنَ مِن مَّكَانٍ بَعِيدٍ. They are being called from a distant place. They hear some sound, but they are not able to understand and benefit from this sound. Similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَإِذَا مَا أُنزِلَتْ سُورَةٌ فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقُولُ أَيُّكُمْ زَادَتْهُ هَذِهِ إِيمَانًا فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَزَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَهُمْ يَسْتَبْشِرُونَ وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ فَزَادَتْهُمْ رِجْسًا إِلَى رِجْسِهِمْ وَمَاتُوا وَهُمْ كَافِرُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, whenever a surah was revealed, there will be people from amongst them who would say, who has benefit, whose iman has increased because of this surah? So again, this is a reference to the munafiqun. When a surah was revealed, they turn around and say, did you find that beneficial? And we see this, unfortunately, now in our case. We attend durus of the Quran, durus of the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and we come out and we say, did we find that beneficial? Was that really beneficial? We unfortunately hear, especially in some Islamic circles, we should be teaching our children financial skills. Don't teach them hadith and Quran. What benefit is that? وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Quran, hadith, this is the true guidance. If we are upon the Quran and the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, every other aspect of our life will fall into place. It is not to say the other types of education, the other types of training is not important. But it is not to give them preference over the learning of the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So when a verse would be revealed, they turn to each other and say, who benefited from this? Whose iman increased from this? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those people who have iman in their hearts, their iman increased in addition to the iman which they already had. فَهُمْ يَسْتَبْشِرُونَ. And they feel a sense of happiness. They rejoice whenever they learn something new. Whenever a new surah was revealed, or in our case, when we learn something new, we rejoice. As for those who have an illness in their heart, then it increases their rijs, the filth which is in the heart. It increases in addition to the filth that was already there. وَمَاتُوا وَهُمْ كَافِرُونَ. And they die upon their state of kufr. They may have been in the situation, seeing Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam receiving revelation, experienced everything that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam told them, yet because of the illness in the heart, they were never able to benefit therefrom. And they died in the state of kufr. So respected brothers and elders, we understand from these few verses which we have read, that it is to do with the internal state of our heart, that we will benefit from the Quran, or this Quran will be a means of our going astray. It is the situation of our heart. It is important whenever we sit in a majlis of the dars of the Quran, we sit with a clean heart. We open up our hearts and we allow the hidayah which is coming from Allah Ta'ala to enter into our hearts. The nur of the Quran, the light of the Quran, we allow it to penetrate into our heart. And inshallah we'll be going through some practical steps and those things which prevent us from benefiting from the Quran. Inshallah we'll go through at a later date. Inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to benefit from the Quran, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from amongst those people for whom the Quran is shifa and rahmah, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to live upon the hidayah, the guidance of the Quran. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability